So we're going to be presenting today on our zero emission vehicle analysis and planning that we did as fellows for the EDF, Environmental Defense Fund, and General Services and Fleet Management. So the objectives of our summer fellowship were really to develop the business case for light, medium, and heavy-duty zero-emission vehicles, to identify potential fleet electrification opportunities within each division to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and to develop a roadmap for early-stage policy and infrastructure deployment planning. So if you look at this roadmap for electrification, you can really see that we were focusing on these first two stages here of feasibility and early planning and business case development, and hopefully leaving General Services with enough information to go on to those next implementation steps. And the big picture takeaway that we found from our summer is that sedans, light-duty pickup trucks, and transit buses are ready to be electrified. This electrification has the potential to save $57 million over the lifetime of the vehicles and 12,200 metric tons of CO2 equivalents. And just a little bit about us. My name is Cassidy. I am an MPA candidate at Columbia University studying energy and environmental policy. Tunmise Raji is a PhD candidate studying sustainability at the Rochester Institute of Technology. And we're both part of the Environmental Defense Fund Climate Corps Fellowship Program. This program selects graduate students with analytical and project management backgrounds. It matches us with a host organization, and then it trains us on technical environmental solutions. And so we've spent the last summer since early June working for the city. And now I'm going to pass it over to Tunmise to give a brief introduction.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Next slide. So the motivation for this work really came about from the carbon neutrality and the renewable energy action plan that the city adopted last year. And in this particular work, it was discovered that some of the most important action plan to really move this the city towards its carbon neutrality goals have to do with like electrification of transportation. So here in this slide we see some of the investment topics that can really move the city towards its goals. So things like heavy duty and light duty fleet electrification, power transit electrification, and also transit bus electrification. Next slide, please. Yeah. So in this particular report, it was discovered that fleet and transportation make up about 75% of the city's fuel-based emissions and about 43% of the city's overall emission. So really being able to clean up this particular sector has the potential to really move the city towards its goals. Yeah, so also in the action plan, the developers try to really identify what sectors, the potential contributions from each investment topic. So in this waterfall chart on the right-hand side of the slide shows the potential contributions towards the carbon neutrality goal. So we see here like the width of the bars really show like by how much percentage each of these investments can really move the city towards its goal. So we see here that light duty fleet electrification can contribute about 15% towards the city's carbon neutrality goal. So if we sum up all these potential contributions, we come to about 43% reduction in the city's emissions. Next slide, please. Yeah. So currently the city has like a lot of existing sustainability actions, right? So a testament to this was like recently the city of Durham fleet management team received the 2020 Green Fleet Award from the 100 best fleets. Some other interesting initiatives that have been developed like in the past few months are like the city added about 33 hybrid police cruisers to its fleet since 2017. Also greenhouse gas emissions from city building and operation emissions has reduced by 20% between 2010 and 2020. Now, we would say arguably the most important planned action right now that the city is trying to explore is to electrify a significant portion of the city's vehicle fleets and transit system vehicles.
Awesome. Now I'm going to go through some current trends in vehicle electrification adoption. And so there are three key reasons to adopt electric vehicles. First, market drivers. So if you look at this chart on the right, you can see that EVs now make up a little over 8% of the global passenger vehicle market sales. In terms of health benefits, you can have up to 84 billion in avoided health impacts for Durham by 2050. And fleet benefits include the reduced cost of maintenance, reduced cost of fuel, and just overall reduced total lifetime ownership costs for many vehicles. So going into some of these market drivers, you can see in this graph that in the past decade, that lithium-ion battery packs have fallen about 89% in price. So that's a huge decrease. And in just the last 3 years, battery capacity is up 33%. And all this is leading towards upfront cost parity for electric vehicles without additional incentives or funding expected in the next 2 years. You can also see in this chart that the price of gas and diesel are really volatile. And so it's hard to predict the total lifetime cost when this price is changing so quickly. But overall, these prices remain much higher than electricity prices, and electricity has remained relatively stable since this was being tracked. Now we can see that manufacturer targets are also trending towards increased electric vehicle sales. So if you look at this graph, each little dot represents an announcement by one of these manufacturers that they are committing toward a certain portion of their sales towards EVs or a certain amount of production towards EVs. And so these internal combustion engine vehicles or conventional vehicles are represented, or the phase-out commitments represent about 27% of the global market. So you can see that producers are really trending towards increasing their production of EVs. You can also see that consumers are purchasing more electric vehicles. So in the past year, even with supply chain concerns, sales for electric vehicles that are light duty are up 10%, and available light duty electric vehicle models reach 450 in 2021. So for medium and heavy duty vehicles, the Department of Energy has reported that by 2030, 50% of medium and heavy duty vehicles, these are your big trucks, will be cheaper to buy, own, and operate than their conventional counterparts. And all of these large vehicles are in line to reach cost parity by 2035. Something else to note is that the city of Durham already has 7 electric vehicles in use as of this past fiscal year. Now, for some city of Durham specific information, we can see that in this graph on the right, since 2018, when this number started being tracked, there has been a 47% increase in electric vehicle registrations and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. In this graph on the left, and we really show that this is an equity issue for the city of Durham. So when overlaid with ozone air pollution, socioeconomic factors like race and economic status really play a role in this pollution impact. Some barriers to electrification that we'll discuss a little more later in the presentation include consumer education, range anxiety, supply chain concerns, higher initial capital costs, grid readiness, and culture change. And so in conclusion, really the reasons to adopt EVs, the future is electric. This is the way the market for both producers and consumers is moving. It reduces greenhouse gas emissions, it reduces these critical air pollutant emissions, and it's overall cheaper than the fuel alternative for many models. Now I'll give a brief overview of the City of Durham fleet, just to give some context of all the vehicles we're talking about. So as of this month, there were a little over 1,400 vehicles in the fleet. For light-duty vehicles, this is your sedans, pickup trucks, SUVs, work trucks, vans, and minivans. They make up about 2/3 of the fleet. For the other third of the fleet, you have your medium and heavy-duty vehicles. And so these are your more specialized vehicles like street sweepers, dump trucks, sewer cleaners, school buses, work trucks, refuse trucks, and buses. We also looked at all light-duty vehicles that are reaching their end of life by fiscal year 27. And this is just because the market is changing so rapidly, we didn't want to extend our analysis to those vehicles that are more than 5 years out. Because medium and heavy-duty vehicles market is moving a little slower, we included all medium and heavy-duty vehicles that are owned by the city fleet in our analysis. And now I'm going to pass it back over to Tumishe.
Thank you. In the next section of this presentation, we'll give a brief overview of the methodology that we went through to really assess these vehicles. So we start with the data sources. So we got a lot of information on the current state of the fleet. So things like the annual vehicle miles traveled by each vehicle, like the acquisition cost, and like similar information. So we got a lot of this data from fleet management departments and also from Durham. Then similarly, we also obtained data from Duke Energy. So here we got information on the carbon intensity of the grid. So basically, like how many kilograms or pounds of carbon dioxide is emitted per kilowatt hour of electricity. And then to really ensure that our analysis was like industry standard, we used a couple of industry standard vehicle assessment models. So one of them is A-Fleet, which was developed by the Argonne National Lab, and also Drive, which was developed by the Atlas Public Policy and Electrification Coalition. So we used these tools and these data sources to do a comprehensive techno-economic and environmental assessment of the vehicles in the city fleet. Next slide, please. Yeah, and then to really come up with this model, we had to make some assumptions, right? So we'll say like perhaps the most important assumption has to do with the maintenance and repair cost of EVs. So from a study that was released by the Argonne National Lab, it was discovered that EVs require about 60% of the maintenance and repair cost of ICEVs. So ICEVs are internal combustion engine vehicles, so like your conventional vehicles, while EVs are electric vehicles. Also from Duke Energy, we obtained information on the current grid mix. So that is like so basically like the kind of generation systems that supply the energy that is used in the city of Durham. So from the data we got, we discovered that about 58% of the electricity in Durham is actually from carbon-free sources. So we got 58% by summing up the energy produced by the nuclear power plants, the biomass plants, and also solar systems. Then we also used some other inputs that we obtained from fleet management department. So things like discount rate, inflation, electricity cost, gasoline cost, diesel cost. So you would notice here that the gasoline cost here is about 2.84, which is, is a lot lower than what you would see in typical filling stations in the city. The reason is because the city typically pays lower. The city has access to a lower price for gasoline because the city's gasoline is, you don't have to pay tax on the gasoline that is used by the city. Also, we are using the average for the fiscal year 22. So we're using like the annual average over the over a 12-month period. Also, we also use the social cost of carbon, which we obtained from, which is the recommended factor by Biden's administration. Next slide, please. Yeah. And then the next step was really to do some data processing. So after obtaining data from the fleet management information system, we try to identify one representative vehicle for each vehicle type, right? So the first classification we did was to divide the vehicles into light duty vehicles, which is LDV here, and medium and heavy duty vehicles. So in light duty vehicles, we have vehicles like sedans, SUVs, minivans and vans, and in medium and heavy duty, we have delivery trucks, refuse trucks, and work trucks. So for each of these vehicle types, we identified one representative vehicle, which in most of the cases is actually the most common make and model, because the most common makes and model for that particular vehicle type. And then for that vehicle type, we calculated things like the average repair cost, the average maintenance cost, and the average annual miles traveled by each representative vehicle. Then also we try to match each of these vehicles with a viable, proven alternative vehicles. So in many of the cases, we considered electric vehicles. So we try to look for an EV that can really meet the characteristics of the ICEV. Yeah. And then we pass this information to a total cost of ownership model, which I'll be discussing in the next slide. Yeah. So the total cost of ownership, also known as TCO, what it tries to do is really to calculate a dollar figure, so like an amount that a vehicle owner will incur over the lifetime of the vehicle. So it takes in a lot of inputs. So things like the acquisition cost, the depreciation, the fuel cost, the cost of insurance and service and maintenance, and then it tries to calculate the net present value of all these costs. So we used a couple of industry standard tools here. So we used A-Fleet and Drive tool. Now each of these tools are there like pros and cons, right? So what we tried to do was create a combined tool for the city that really takes the best of both worlds. So we took the best properties of A-Fleet and the best properties of Drive tool and combined them together to create a comprehensive tool. Next slide. Yeah, so in this slide, I'll just be in this slide, I'll give a brief illustration of really the number that we're trying to calculate. So typically your alternative vehicles, so your EVs, typically cost a lot more to purchase, right? So they have a higher acquisition cost, but at the same time, these vehicles have a lower operating and maintenance cost when compared to ICEVs. So really, the main aim of our analysis was really to find this break-even point, which is the point where the savings or the potential savings by using these alternative vehicles would sum up to the initial increased acquisition cost that you had to incur to buy an EV or an alternative vehicle. So here we see that there's a break-even point where that particular amount adds up to the initial increased acquisition cost, and then the TCO, which is the total cost of ownership, will be the final number at the end of the year. So here in year 4, the TCO will be the total cost of driving for both vehicles. Next slide, please. Yeah, and then to really do this analysis, we had to explore several scenarios, right? So, some inputs that were varying in our scenario are things like the lifetime of the vehicles. So really, the longer you use the vehicles, the more advantage you are giving to the alternative vehicle, right? Because, like I said earlier, they actually have a lower operating and maintenance cost. So really, the actual lifetime that is selected has a significant impact on the viability of the vehicles. Some other inputs that we try to vary are things like infrastructure cost. So a lot of the infrastructure costs to fuel the conventional vehicle has already been incurred by the city. So really to enable an apple to apple comparison, we suggested excluding the charging infrastructure cost from the vehicle analysis, so that to ensure that we're really comparing similar costs in our models, right? So in this presentation, we'll be presenting on the second scenario, which is a scenario that explores the recommended lifetime by the city and also excludes the charging infrastructure cost. But in the appendix section of the presentation, we include the result of these other scenarios that I mentioned here. Next slide. Yeah. Then next, I will discuss the result of our analysis on light duty vehicles. So before going into that, we try to assess the utilization of the vehicles, right? So basically, the fleet management department recommends 6,000 miles per year. So basically, for a vehicle to be considered well utilized, the assumption is that the vehicle should travel at least 6,000 miles every year. So going with this metric, we discovered that about 75% of the vehicles actually exceed this metric. So about 75% of the vehicles actually travel more than 6,000 miles every year. So this is testament to the right sizing and the right typing that is currently done in light duty vehicles in the fleet. Yeah, and then now we'll go into the results of the second scenario, that is scenario that assumes a recommended use by the city and also excludes the charging infrastructure cost. Yeah, so we start with sedans. So the city currently has about 443 sedans in the fleet. So I will spend a brief moment to describe this particular slide because we use this same template for comparing all the other vehicles. So in this slide, the first row, which is the row with the vehicle, would highlight the two vehicles that are being compared, right? So in this case, it will be the Dodge Charger, which is the ICEV, that is the conventional vehicle, and then the next line shows the EV. So in this case, is the Ford Mustang Mach-E. Then the next row gives a couple of information on the vehicles. So the assumed useful life and also the assumed vehicle miles traveled. So in this case, we found out that sedans in the city fleet travel about 10,000 miles every year, and they have a median lifetime of about 6 years. And then the last row shows the result of our TCO analysis. So the total cost of ownership of each of these vehicles. And then on the right-hand side, we show the contributions, the various factors that influence this total cost of ownership. And then on the left-hand side, we show a streetlight sign that really give like a brief indication of the summary of this particular slide. So here, in this case, we are comparing a Dodge Charger to a Ford Mustang Mach-E. From the result of our TCO, we see that it's actually cheaper over the lifetime of the vehicle to use a Ford Mustang Mach-E, because here we see that the TCO is about 41,000 versus 50,000 for the Dodge Charger. And we see like the main driver of this cost is actually the fuel. So we see the fueling cost is actually a lot lower for EVs when compared to ICEVs. So the summary here is we think the business case actually exists for switching to EVs for the sedan vehicle type. Next slide. Next, we move on to minivans. So the city has like just about 7 minivans in the fleet. And here we are comparing a Dodge Grand Caravan with a Chrysler Pacifica plug-in hybrid electric vehicle. So for minivans, we couldn't find a viable pure EV replacement. So here we are suggesting a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle, which has both a gasoline engine and also an electric engine, and it couples them together to achieve a high efficiency. So the result of our TCO shows that it's actually cheaper to own the plug-in hybrid over the lifetime of the vehicles. But here for this particular use case, we recommend waiting a few more years to see how the market develops and to see how the market comes up with a viable EV alternative to the minivan. Next slide, please. Next, we discuss SUVs. So here we are comparing the Ford Explorer, which is the police utility SUV, versus the same vehicle that was discussed earlier, the Ford Mustang Mach-E. So the result of our TCO shows that it's actually cheaper to own a Ford Mustang Mach-E than to like it's cheaper to own a Ford Mustang Mach-E than to use a Ford Explorer. But one thing to note here is really in this particular slide, we're not really comparing the same vehicle, right? So we are comparing a large SUV, which is the Ford Explorer, to a compact SUV, which is the Ford Mustang Mach-E. So really, like we don't have like an apples to apples comparison here because we couldn't find a pure EV large SUV replacement for the Ford Explorer. But recently Ford announced that a pure EV Ford Explorer should be released in the next few years. So they are currently estimating that there should be a Ford EV Explorer by 2023. So for this particular use case, for this particular use case, we suggest two things. One is waiting a few more years for the Ford Explorer EV, or if the actual use case could be met by, the actual vehicle needs could be met by the Ford Mustang Mach-E subcompact SUV, then we suggest making the switch, because the result of our TCO shows that it's actually cheaper to own a Ford Mustang Mach-E. Next, we'll move on to the shuttle or the power transit van. Here we're comparing a Transit Connect with the Ford e-Transit. We're assuming an 8 years lifetime use and also about 5,000 miles traveled every year. From our analysis, we see that it's actually more expensive to own the Ford e-Transit when compared to the Ford Transit Connect. So we see we are looking at 56,000 over the 8 years usage of the vehicle versus 44,000 for the Ford Transit Connect. So here we conclude that we should wait a few more years before switching this particular vehicle. Then I'm moving on to light duty pickup trucks. We have about 124 of these vehicles in the fleet. And the vehicles that we're comparing here is the Ford F-150 Lightning versus the conventional Ford F-150. And here we see it's actually cheaper to use Ford F-150 Lightning because we are looking at a TCO of about 47,000 versus 56,000. So here we conclude that it actually makes sense from a financial and environmental perspective to really make the switch now, because it's cheaper in the long run to really use the Ford F-150 Lightning. Yeah, and then the last light duty vehicle case that we'll be discussing is the Ford F-250. So this is like a larger, more powerful version of the previous vehicles. So this vehicle can tow about 15,000 pounds and has a payload limit of about 5,000 pounds. And here, we also couldn't find a true match. We couldn't find a true matching alternative vehicle. So once again, here we suggest a Ford F-450 Lightning, which is a much smaller vehicle. So this vehicle can only tow 10,000 pounds versus the 15,000 pounds that the Ford F-250 can tow. And also has a payload limit of about 2,000 pounds versus the 4,260 pounds that the Ford F-250 has. But the result of the TCO shows that it's cheaper to use the Ford F-150 Lightning, so 48,000 versus 72,000. Although, once again, we should note that it's really not the same vehicle that have been compared. So really, we don't have an apples to apple comparison in this case. So here we conclude that we should the decision to really switch these vehicles out would depend on the use case, right? So if the needs can be met by the Ford F-150 Lightning, then we suggest making the switch. But actually, if the vehicle needs, if the needs actually require a Ford F-250, so if we have to tow 15,000 pounds, then we suggest to continue using the Ford F-250 while we wait for the market to develop cleaner alternatives to this vehicle.
Awesome. Now I'm going to go back into that same analysis, but with our medium and heavy duty vehicles. So again, we start with looking at the annual miles traveled for medium and heavy duty vehicles. And so we see here that about 2/5 or 40% of our medium and heavy duty vehicle fleet do not travel 6,000 miles a year. But remember, our medium and heavy duty vehicles are more of our work trucks, our tree cutters, and so they might still be being utilized correctly and utilized in their intended amount, but not necessarily traveling far in terms of miles. And so we tried to look at this approximation of how much are these vehicles being used by looking at their fuel usage. And so we see here that about 1/3 of our medium and heavy duty vehicle fleet doesn't travel or doesn't use at least 1,000 gallons of fuel a year. And again, this is just because some of our vehicles aren't intended to travel far in terms of miles to meet their intended use. And so next, we try and combine these two metrics of miles traveled and fuel used. And so we look at the vehicles that are both low mileage and low fuel. And so here we see that about 15% of our total medium and heavy duty vehicles do not meet this threshold of both traveling at least 3,000 miles a year and using at least 1,000 gallons of fuel per year. About 50% of these vehicles come from public works and water management. And so this is just really outlining the fact that while fleet management is really doing a great job in right sizing, this is only 15% of our fleet. We want to make sure we're utilizing our vehicles correctly in order to make sure we're reducing our carbon emissions where we can. And so again, we're just going to go through that total cost of ownership model and look at our medium and heavy duty vehicle fleet with their electric vehicle alternatives. And remember, these markets are a little further behind than our light duty fleet. So here we start out with looking at street sweepers, and instantly you can see that these vehicles have a lifetime ownership cost that is way more expensive than our light duty fleet. These ones travel about 5,000 miles a year, and you can just see off the bat that that capital cost for the EV, it makes the total cost of ownership too high to recommend switching over from our conventional vehicle. We see this same story again when we're looking at our sewer cleaners. So again, it's just that upfront capital cost of electric vehicles that is just really much higher than our internal combustion engine vehicles. Again, a similar story is being told with our dump trucks. While there is an alternative on the market, it's just really expensive and it doesn't make sense to switch quite yet. Next, we look at refuse trucks, and these ones actually do pay themselves back or meet cost parity in just 5 years. However, we want to note that the vehicles on the market don't meet the city of Durham's duty cycle needs. And so the battery capacity isn't quite there yet, even though the electric vehicle alternative has a lifetime ownership cost that's cheaper. It's not quite a one-to-one replacement. So you couldn't replace an internal combustion engine vehicle with an EV and expect it to do the same job. So for this reason, we really recommend that the city looks at piloting one of these vehicles and working out the kinks of owning an electric refuse truck, but not necessarily replacing the whole fleet with these quite yet. Next, we look at school buses. The city only owns 2 of these vehicles. And again, we see this as a really high total cost of ownership for the electric vehicle. And so it doesn't quite make sense to switch. Something to note here is that there is a lot of federal funding and incentives for electric school buses, and you're starting to see them pop up. And so with all of these electric vehicles, it's something to keep in mind. Just because the total cost of ownership might not make sense, there is some external funding for a lot of these vehicles. Now we look at transit buses. These buses, again, we use them for 15 years. They travel about 60,000 miles a year. And we see that the total cost of ownership makes sense. The EV is much cheaper than the conventional vehicle, and they pay themselves back in just about 5 years of use. And this is a really good thing because these vehicles are already scheduled for replacement by Go Durham, and Go Durham is actually already using 2 of these vehicles now. Next, we look at another delivery step van. So this is a larger van than Tunmise presented. And again, if you look at these pictures, while that total cost of ownership model looks to make sense, it's not quite the same vehicle that we're replacing that electric vehicle with, or that conventional vehicle with. And so even though it'll pay itself back in 4 years, if it's not doing the job we need it to do, it doesn't make sense. And so we're really looking here at which vehicles are candidates for replacement, and will the vehicle meet that duty cycle need? Next, we're looking at our medium duty pickup trucks. And so we can see that this one, we have one EV that might perform the same amount as our Ram 3500, and we can see that there's just no payback. It doesn't make sense to switch these right now. And we see the same story with our heavy duty pickup trucks, our work trucks. The replacement alternative just really is way more than our current vehicle. And so we really recommend waiting to see what comes on the market in the next few years in terms of these vehicles. So some limitations to our analysis. For most medium and heavy duty vehicles, we had to estimate the body cost. So we knew the cost of the cab and the chassis, but the body cost of, say, the dump truck body, the sewer cleaner body, we had to estimate just because this technology is so new, manufacturers aren't really releasing all their quotes yet, but we worked with some quotes and then made an estimation that body costs will cost about 2 times that of the internal combustion engine vehicle. But again, as this technology develops and more manufacturers start putting their prices and quotes out there, we'll be able to more accurately hone in this TCO analysis. Something else to note is that police vehicles' total cost of ownership excludes the cost of making them pursuit ready. We picked the Mustang Mach-E because it can be made pursuit ready. But this again was a little fuzzy on the exact numbers, and so we excluded that cost from the analysis. Something else to note is that a lot of vehicles have electric vehicles that are announced, but they're not available for purchase until model year 2024. And so we really expect the market to change rapidly and for new alternatives to be on the market. And then finally, there were some notable vehicles that we couldn't find viable replacements for. So Tumishe presented minivans, large SUVs, and work trucks that really had no viable electric vehicle alternative quite yet. And then we also excluded fire trucks from our analysis just because we couldn't find one that would meet the city of Durham's needs. And just to sum up this TCO analysis, we have 4 main recommendations. First, there are some vehicles that are ready to be replaced now. Again, those are sedans, light-duty pickup trucks, and transit buses. Second recommendation is to continue right-sizing our fleet. And so less vehicles being used means less emissions. Continuous assessment of underutilized vehicles is good, and we really want to look at replacing our most utilized vehicles first with our electric alternatives. And this is just so you get the most bang for your buck in terms of reduced carbon emissions. Third, there were a few vehicles that we pointed out that are ready to be piloted, that might start to replace and work out some of the kinks of electrification, but aren't ready for full deployment quite yet. And then finally, reassess the market yearly. As we presented earlier, this market is just changing so quickly. Cost parity is expected by 2030 for medium and heavy duty vehicles, and battery size is just increasing really rapidly. And so this is something that you need to look at pretty frequently to make sure that the business case is starting to make sense for certain vehicles.
Okay, in the next section, we discuss about the results from our charging infrastructure design. Next slide. Yeah, so in this slide, we are showing the overnight parking addresses of the city vehicles. So on the map on the right-hand side, we see the overnight parking addresses of both light duty vehicles and medium and heavy duty vehicles. So in this map, the bigger the circle, the higher the number of vehicles that are parked at that particular location. So from this map, we can really see some hotspots are like starting to emerge, right? So there are some places where there are like a lot of vehicles have been parked, and I think those places are potential locations for fast chargers. So DC fast chargers. So on the chart on the left-hand side, we see the address of some of these locations, right? So one is Miss Lake, which is 1970 Camden Avenue. The other one is Peacock, and then the Durham Police Department headquarters also. So these are like some potential locations for putting like fast chargers as the city continues to electrify its fleet. Yeah, then some brief discussions on the on charging infrastructure design and consideration. So there are three commonly used chargers that are available in the market now. So they have different power ratings. So level 1 chargers can power about they have a capacity of about 2.4 kilowatts. Level 2 chargers can go as high as 19 kilowatts, and then level 3 chargers, which are like the DC fast chargers, they have a capacity of up to 350 kilowatts, and these DC chargers can deliver up to 100 miles of range in just 15 minutes. But of course, this depends on the charger, and also the vehicles themselves. So the vehicles actually influence how much energy can go in at a particular point in time. Also, one thing to note here is that as we think about chargers, we also have to think about the upstream infrastructures that is required to power a charger, right? So, for instance, as you think about developing a level 3 charger, you would have to like upgrade some of the upstream power systems, right? So things like the panels, the step-up transformers, the meter panel wiring, they are all like they're all power system components that would have to be upgraded to deliver this increased power capacity. So really to meet this capacity of about 350 kilowatts, we have to really increase the capacity of the upstream infrastructure. Yeah, then the next part of the work was really to identify the number of stations that we would need to sufficiently power these vehicles with with the chargers, right? So here we had to make some assumptions, and we try to be as conservative as possible with the assumptions. So one is we assume that we assume an efficiency of 3 miles per kilowatt hour, which means the vehicle can go 3 miles on 1 kilowatt hour of energy. Then also we assumed level 2 chargers with a capacity of just 9.6 kilowatts. We assumed 8 hours of use of the charger per day, which means like basically like we're only charging just overnight, right? So let's say from like 6 p.m. to like the next morning, and then lastly we estimated the daily miles traveled from the historical usage of the vehicle. So we divided the odometer reading of the vehicle by the number of years the vehicle has been in operation to determine the annual vehicle miles traveled for each vehicle. Now, so we did this analysis on just light duty vehicles. So basically we're looking at about 540 vehicles. And we discovered that we will need about we will need close to 6,000 kilowatt hours every day just to power these 540 vehicles. And remember, this excludes medium and heavy duty vehicles. It excludes the energy consumed during idling, because as you idle, you consume a lot of electricity. And also, so basically we assume, we exclude take-home vehicles, so vehicles that are not parked on city premises. We exclude medium and heavy duty vehicles, and we also exclude energy consumed during idling. And then after removing those components, we see that we need about 6,000 kilowatt hours. And also we need about 113 level 2 charging stations just to power the 540 vehicles. And on the bar graph here, we can see it shows both the number of vehicles at each overnight parking address, and also the number of chargers required to sufficiently power those vehicles. So we see that we don't really have to match these vehicles to the chargers like a 1-to-1 ratio. So we see that there's some possibility of like connecting up to 4, 5, or even 6 vehicles per charger. And then in the next part of the work, we try to estimate we had to come up with like a rule of thumb. So like a rule of thumb for electric vehicle charger design. So assuming 8,200 miles traveled every year, which is the average annual mileage of all light duty vehicles in the fleet, we are recommending a rule of thumb of 6 light duty vehicles per level 2 charger. Of course, this number is just like a rough estimate. It will depend on the actual use of the vehicle. But from our analysis, we see that we can actually we can couple 6 vehicles to 1 charger, assuming 8,200 miles is being traveled by each vehicle. Yeah, and then also the next recommendation is that we should start thinking about building out the upstream power system component that will be required to supply the significant increased energy consumption in the city. So we estimated 6,000 kilowatt hours for just 540 vehicles. We have over like 1,400 vehicles in the fleet, so we can expect to require like a lot more energy to completely electrify these vehicles. And then lastly, we identified some potential locations for DC fast chargers. So these are places where like a lot of vehicles are parked overnight, and also the vehicles parked there travel like a lot of miles. So some top 3 locations for a DC fast charger will be places like Mist Lake, Durham Police Department headquarters, so that's 602 East Main Street, and lastly General Services, so 2011 Faith Street.
Awesome. Now I'm going to go into some quick policy development and research that we looked at in terms of city-facing internal policies we need to look at when considering electrifying our fleet. So there were 2 main buckets of policies we looked at. So charging policies for employees and then vehicle care policies for employees. So I'm going to start with those charging policies. And first we're going to consider at-home charging. So these are the vehicles that city employees take home and they have their overnight address at a residence. This is about 1/4 of our fleet. And a lot of these vehicles are police vehicles. And so we need to think about how do we electrify these vehicles in a way that makes sense in order to meet our carbon emissions reductions goals. So here we do an analysis of how much the electric vehicle supply equipment, those charging stations, are going to cost if we install them in each city employee's home with a take-home vehicle. We can see that the lifetime net savings from reduced emissions is about $130,000 if we do this. We also outline that there will potentially need to be a $35 a month automatic reimbursement for electricity costs for these employees with an application for additional funds if this $35 doesn't cover your electricity bill for that charging station. And then we also recommend looking at an annual charging allowance assessment, even though the price of electricity is relatively stable, just making sure that that will meet the needs of city employees. We also recommend looking at installation of these chargers in waves. And so for the first wave, looking at those easier places to install charging stations, which is single family residential homes. And then we also thought about removing these stations. And so if a city employee no longer needs a take-home vehicle or no longer works for the city, we recommend giving them the option to purchase this charging infrastructure from the city, or letting the city remove this infrastructure from the residents. Next, we look at employee charging. So this policy has to do with city employees bringing their personal electric vehicles to work. And what do we do in terms of charging stations and letting them charge their personal vehicle at work using city charging stations? And so there's a few examples we looked at from the US federal government. And so here we lay out a few of the options of what these administrations do. So first option is that employees that drive their personal electric vehicles just should not be allowed to charge their vehicles at charging infrastructure designated for fleet vehicles. Another option is that employees can pay for their charging infrastructure costs at city-facing charging stations. And so here in this graph, you see that based on or depending on the type of charging station that the city installs, there are a few options for how much you charge an employee per day. And then third, the city can install employee-specific charging stations and let these be separate from fleet charging stations. And so this is really to ensure that there's no competition between city personal vehicles and fleet vehicles. These policies also ensure that the city is not giving away that electricity for free to employees, and making sure that there is a plan for when employees inevitably start adopting the electric vehicles. Next, we look at odometer reporting. So with our conventional vehicles, they have regularly scheduled maintenance like oil changes, where they have to go into fleet management. And there's other metrics that fleet is able to take and assess for the vehicle health at these points. For electric vehicles that don't have these regularly scheduled maintenances, we recommend looking at some sort of fleet managed telematics to report these numbers back to fleet. So you can account for these metrics like vehicle miles traveled and vehicle emissions. Next, we look at some fuel reduction initiatives. So there are a few examples of cities and counties that reduce fuel through making their fleets more efficient. And so we really think that it's important to assess the business case for centralized telematics in our city-owned vehicles. As it stands, we currently have a city policy that prohibits idling for non-essential vehicles. But obviously some vehicles have to idle to either function or for OSHA requirements and whatnot. For the General Services Department, where we looked at our department-specific telematics, we see that idling is responsible for about 3% of fuel burned. And so something we need to think about is training vehicle operators on idle reduction strategies, or just again, assessing the business case for telematics. Something to note here is that if these vehicles are electrified, it doesn't really matter how long you idle for. And so that might, again, be a case for vehicle electrification. Again, so we have a 3-point recommendation plan here. First, reducing fuel usage by right-sizing our fleet and looking at idle reduction strategies. Second, preparing for take-home vehicles to be electrified. So implementing a take-home vehicle charging policy and thinking really critically about who gets charging and when. And third, to plan for employees to use EV infrastructure and charging stations at city facilities. So our high-level takeaways from this whole presentation is that there are certain vehicles ready for electrification. Those are sedans, light-duty pickup trucks, and transit buses. We need to frequently reassess our market for electric vehicles. There are lots of new electric vehicles in the pipeline, and we expect those to meet the needs of certain vehicles in the coming years. Third, planning, so preparing for vehicle electrification through charging infrastructure and city-facing policies. And then finally, EVs overall will save money for the city and reduce emissions. So with just these 3 vehicles that are ready for electrification, we again estimate that it'll save the city $57 million and about 12,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalents. And we'd really like to take a moment to thank General Services, Fleet Management, Go Durham, and the Environmental Defense Fund for all the data sharing, information, and support y'all gave us over the course of this summer. We wouldn't have been able to do any of this work without you all. And open it up if we have a few minutes. We might not for questions. It is Team Miche and I's last day at the city, so we'd like you to forward any questions or emails onto Joe, John, or Amy, and we can also send these slides to anyone who's interested.